And now I'd like to ask our Regional Secretary, Gerard Coyne, to look at some of the practical implications of this bill for members. Just a little bit of background on Gerard, for those of you who don't know him. He's the Regional Secretary for Unite the Union West Midlands, served in the role for 14 years, and has overall responsibility for in excess of 150,000 Unite members in the region. It's Gerard who's brought us here today, and it's his initiative to join with the sister unions, Unison GMB, to consult with members who are represented by Sajid Javid's constituency to ensure that they have the opportunity to hear expert opinions on the bill, as we've already started to discuss today. So again, without further ado, Gerard, thank you very much.
Thanks. Thank you. Thanks very much, Chair. And this wouldn't have happened without the cooperation and commitment of sister trade unions who are represented on the panel this evening. But as you'd already outlined, it was actually a deliberate ploy to have the meeting here in Bromsgrove this evening, because we wanted to write to all of our members, the Unite, Unison and GMB members in Bromsgrove constituency, to give the MP, the local MP, the opportunity to come here and explain to his constituents why he thinks it's necessary to add further shackles to the British trade union movement on top of what is already recognised as the most onerous restrictions on trade unionism, arguably in Western Europe, maybe other parts of the world as well. And I did write to Sajid Javid as the local MP and business secretary to attend, and I got a courteous letter back from the Department of Business, Innovation and Skills, and he says, unfortunately, due to heavy diary commitments, he will be unable to accept your invitation. He has, however, asked me to pass on his best wishes for the event. Now, I'm not sure whether he thinks we're organising a harvest festival here tonight, or actually a serious meeting to discuss the legislation that his government is intent on introducing. But I have to say I was somewhat surprised, to say the least, by that correspondence, because this is a very detailed and savage attack on organised labour in this country, and it's so detailed that actually what we've agreed to do tonight in terms of the speakers is to break up the various areas so that you get the full picture of exactly what is proposed in this legislation. I'm going to deal primarily and specifically on the industrial action side of things and the right to strike, because there is an awful lot of content that's proposed in this bill. And I'm going to run through some of the key elements of it and then actually try and explode some of the myths as to why it's suggested that this legislation is needed. So some of the key bits that is going to be introduced at the final reading that's taking place on Monday. That's why we're lobbying Parliament on the 2nd of November, because it's the final reading in the House of Commons, and then it goes off to the Lords. And I hope the Lords have got into the habit of throwing legislation back to the Commons after this week, so I'm trusting that they'll do the same for this. But it essentially says that for any industrial action to take place, then there has to be at least a 50% turnout in all strike ballots. In certain sectors that are designated, called important public services, and I'll come back to what is deemed to be important, of that 50% vote, then there has to be a 40% affirmative vote for all those entitled to participate. Unions must provide a reasonably detailed indication of the dispute with the employer. We already have to comply with quite stringent legislation to explain what the trade dispute is about in correspondence to employers, but that's going to be further extended. Ballot papers must describe the form of industrial action and the proposed timetable. There are already quite stringent restrictions on making sure that you tell the membership what questions are going to be asked as to whether it's strike or action short of a strike. And ballot mandates are going to be limited to 4 months in total. There are going to be specific restrictions on the right to picket, including the requirement to appoint identified picket supervisors and carrying a letter of authorisation that must be shown to any person who reasonably seeks it. And it also means that they will have to wear, anybody taking part in picketing action will have to wear a designated armband to show that they are the authorised person. And also it will remove the ban on the use of agency workers while industrial action is taking place, and bring agency workers into a workplace will again become legitimate and legal. Alongside this, there are other things about extending the role of the certification officer to regulate unions, particularly imposing financial penalties if we don't comply with some of these key elements around industrial action. And there will need to be an annual report to the certification officer on the levels of industrial action. And also, for the privilege of all of this, trade unions are going to be asked to pay for the role of the certification officer rather than it being paid for out of government funding. All of those elements and everything else that's going to be described to you tonight are happening for, in my view, very specific reasons, and they are three key elements. One of it is to undermine the engagement and the role of trade unions in the public sector, because they have been effectively the official voice campaigning against austerity and the reduction and cuts in services to the public at large, and clearly the government don't like that because that's their agenda. It's about undermining collective bargaining to restrict the right of strike action, so that effectively you don't have any collective bargaining rights anymore. All you end up with is collective begging. You go cap in hand to the employer and hope that you'll get a pay increase, not be able to use your legal entitlement to withdraw your labour. And it's also about silencing the political voice of the trade union movement through the Labour Party and more broader campaigns in the use of our political funds. And I know colleagues are going to spend a bit more time on that this evening later on. I just want to return now to the strike action issues. I mean, in regard to the use of agency labour in particular, you know, there is a real threat here for anybody coming in as an agency worker being pitched into difficult industrial action situations, being asked to undertake work that in many instances could be dangerous, there could be health and safety risks, without proper protection, but at the same time as a strike is taking place. And actually the body that oversees agency workers, the Recruitment and Employment Confederation, have made their voice known that publicly they don't think this is a good idea. They don't think that their agency confederation, the people who are affiliated to it, want this to happen, because they see the pitfalls for agency workers going into a very difficult industrial relations climate. In terms of the 50% threshold that they're imposing, this has been done very, very deliberately. There's no doubt about that. You know, we are a democratic organisation, the trade union movement, and we work on the basis of most democracies that you need a majority to obtain the support of the action you want to take. But with this 50% threshold, nearly half of all strikes since 1997 would have been illegal as a result of imposing that threshold. A threshold that members of Parliament don't have to uphold to, a threshold that the Cabinet or the Government doesn't have to uphold to. But as a democratic organisation, the only one in civil society that is going to be forced to have that sort of threshold. And in terms of the occupations, the important public services as they deem it, that will be required to have that 40% majority then in favour, on top of the threshold of 50% taking part, a 40% engagement on that, or support for it. They've set part in the statute so far 5 occupations, in public sector, in transport, in education, and interestingly in nuclear decommissioning. Now that may surprise you, that they've just singled out nuclear decommissioning. It's certainly surprised our members in nuclear decommissioning, because they've not taken part in strike action in living memory. So they are wondering why the hell they've been singled out as part of these important occupations when they haven't actually been involved in strike action in over a generation. So it quite clearly shows that they are trying to make these occupations up, and the more worrying thing is that in the statute that they're bringing through, they can actually just move a statutory amendment that allows them to then extend those occupations without having to come back to Parliament. So they could just say, oh well, now actually it covers this grade of worker because that puts the public at risk. Well, any of you who have been actively involved in strikes in the public sector will know trade unions never put the interest of patients or those that require a service as a life-threatening requirement. We never do that. We have means to stop that happening, and we make sure that we do. The arbitrary time limits that are being enforced in terms of the ballot process go on top of what are some of the most restrictive timetables for trade unions anywhere in the Western world. So already we have to send a copy of the ballot paper to the employer, we have to serve notice and tell the employer when we're going to conduct that ballot. We then have to notify the employer immediately, having shown him a copy of the ballot paper and the questions that we're asking and the groups that are going to be balloted. We then have to notify him immediately of the outcome of the ballot. Well, now we're going to have to give not just 7 days notice, which was the previous requirement, we're going to have to give a full fortnight's notice of any action that is to be taken. And of course this goes hand in hand with the agency labour changes, because it then gives the employer the opportunity to go and get agency workers in to cover the jobs of people who are going to take strike action. And it just goes to illustrate that all the way through there is a weaving pattern of actually frustrating and handcuffing trade unions from taking legitimate industrial action, and no more so than when it comes to peaceful picketing. There's already codes of practices on picketing that effectively mean that only 6 people can picket a workplace. They've moved to now and try and extend the legislation to also cover demonstrations, social media, a whole host of things that actually have a really worrying implication for our civil liberties in general. So trade unions, when they're taking part in any protest plans around strike action, will have to inform the employer and the certification officer 14 days in advance of when that protest will take place, whether there's going to be loudspeakers, whether there's going to be any props, whether there's going to be any banners. It is absolutely ridiculous the levels that we're going to have to go through to notify about lawful public protest. How long is it going to be that that public protest extensions is going to happen to other parts of civic society? It's going to require unions to report any plans on whether we're going to run things on Twitter or social media and Facebook, and the content that we're intending to post on those Facebook accounts and social media. And if they don't comply with that, if trade unions don't inform the certification officer and the employer, then we can face hefty financial fines, and it clearly undermines the freedom of expression and the right to protest. Along with this, we'll have to appoint picket supervisors. We're going to have to put armbands on those picket supervisors. They're going to have to be issued with a letter to identify that they have authority to act as a picket supervisor, and wear a badge and armband to identify themselves. Now, even Tory MPs, David Davis, he's no friend of the Labour movement, but David Davis has said these sort of measures are reminiscent of Franco's Spain. And he's absolutely right. They are reminiscent of a dictatorship, not a democracy. So it just goes to show that in terms of the levels that they're prepared to go to, they're not only enforcing attacks on civil liberties, they are also criminalising huge elements of these regulations. The Police Federation and indeed the Chief Constables have come out and said, we don't believe we need or want these powers of criminal action against pickets, because in the main, most picketing activity these days is peaceful. And we don't want to have to arrest people for being in breach of this legislation, because we've got better things to be doing with our time in terms of hard-pressed cuts in the police force across the country anyway. And in terms of the peaceful protest linked to industrial disputes, I've already said that the certification officer will oversee that. We'll have to report it to him. But it's estimated it's going to cost trade unions somewhere in the region of £1 million a year to fund, and that's currently on their activity levels now, the certification officer and that will continue to extend because there's going to be much more activity for the certification officer to be involved in. So you can really see that this is, a fundamental attack on the universal right to take strike action. And I just want to set this in context as I draw my comments to a conclusion. There are a number of bodies that have said, actually, this is fixing a problem that doesn't exist. Industrial relations in the UK is already reformed. It has become a dramatically different landscape. For me, as the Regional Secretary in the West Midlands of Unite, with over 150,000 members, I have to authorise every single bit of industrial action that takes place by our members. Just to give you a flavour of how regular that is, I have had, in the past 3 months, one strike involving 17 members. This month alone, I've authorised 2 ballots for potential industrial action. So it just shows you how, this is trying to tackle something that doesn't exist, not least of which the fact that if you average the 6.5 million people who are in a trade union today over the number of days of strike action that have taken place over the past 12 months, it means that we'll be calling on trade unionists to take strike action 1 day in every 15 years. That's how bad the level of industrial action is. Actually, that's how good the level of industrial action is, because in the main we're not having to resort to strike action. We're resolving disputes and doing what trade unions have always done, negotiate a deal with employers to the benefit of our members. And this is recognised. There are so many organisations in this field, academics, the Institute of Professional Development, the HR governing body, they've all said, we don't think there's any need for this legislation whatsoever. And clearly, it is politically motivated to try and shackle trade unions and prevent them legitimately representing working people's rights. Thanks very much, and I'll hand it